gives us an opportunity to do so much. It's amazing what a single breath and a pause can do to change the whole energy of the situation, give you an opportunity to make a different choice.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about that moment of these patterns breaking apart. Even though the patterns are breaking apart, we're still we're enculturated to go in these particular patterns, and it's very hard to break out of them. They're deep, deep grooves. So the pause is just a fantastic tool to say, wait a minute, is that what I want to do? Is that what I want to say? Is that how I want to be? Right? Is that in line with my current time values or not?
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today, our special guest shares her profound body of work and how it is powerfully useful in these times of collapse. Please join me in welcoming Mirah Love. Welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, and I'm Dean Walker. And this is an extraordinary time. This is last part of September, actually first part of October in 2019. The September itself has just been a time of extraordinary expansion and possibility, new possibility showing up in not just the Poetry of Predicament podcast, but also in the livingresilience.net website and all of its offerings. And then the coaching that we offer, and everything seems to be in an expansion right now, and also a refinement of expression that I am clear, even having just met our guest today, Mirah Love, I get a sense that this will be right on track with the past few episodes of the podcast, in that there's a sobriety and there's a depth of trusting beingness and presence, what a number of my other guests might call activated presence at this time, as opposed to the binary that tends to show up in default culture of I'm in despair because all these terrible things are going on, or I'm in denial because all of these things are going on. And there's it's hard to overstate the difference between that binary and this notion of living from activated presence, or living from a far deeper sense of a return to agency which we've forfeited by being a part of the business as usual paradigm. So I know that's a big mouthful, and I'm appreciating Mirah and her patience right now with this kind of long, verbose introduction. But what I'm trying to express in my awkward way is the alignment that I can already feel is here in our brief interactions that we've had prior to this time. And of course, her recommendation, who came from Jack Adam Weber, and a very dear friend. And I just am looking forward to this. The exploration really wide open here. We will track where we do in this time together. And so, Mirah Love, I was so appreciated if you would come onto the screen and to introduce yourself as you'd like to be known, and also just feel free to launch right into this track wherever you're compelled to launch in. We of course have talked a bit about the notion of parenting in these times. And it sounds like we're going to have something to talk about with that. But I really invite you again to introduce yourself in the way that you'd like to be known, and also start us on a track that is alive for you now. And so, Mirah, thank you so much for joining me here, and let's go.
Great, thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for having me. And I appreciated everything you said. It sounded very good to me. So hi everyone, my name is Mirah Love, and as Dean asked, I'll give you just a little background on myself. I serve as an interfaith spiritual counselor. I work with individuals, with families, with larger groups, and I'm also the founder and the guide for a community called MirahLoveWisdom that teaches and researches energy healing for women. And I also spent about 20 years teaching in institutes of higher education. I was a tenured professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And my research at those times, and still, but particularly during that time, was in somatic consciousness, in creative process. So how the body collects information, how it holds information, how it tells its stories. And that for me was always a beautiful intersection between spiritual practice and embodied spiritual practice. So rather than making a distinction between spirit as somewhere else, and then you're here on the physical plane, how to really integrate your awareness of the divinity of being here on the planet. So that's very short introduction to what I do with others.
That's the short introduction. The first time we talked, you said a bit of your resume, and it's staggering to me how and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm just so curious. Do you ever look at your own resume and see how extraordinarily strong it is for exactly what we're facing these days? It just seems like you were going down this essentials list, like as good as it could possibly get. Do you ever get that feeling?
Well, sometimes I feel like there are pieces that I have dedicated my life to that, yes, absolutely serve me now.
Mm.
And then there are a lot of other arenas, like how do I grow food? How do I source my own water? Things like that that I don't really have any skills in, or have very minimal skills in. So I feel like, yes, there are certain things in terms of how to be with myself, how to navigate challenging times,
Mm-hmm.
that I feel like, yes, those are skills that I'm still working on, but that I have to a certain degree stabilized, integrated, and can share with others.
Yeah.
And then I feel like there's a lot of support that I'm reaching out for skills that others have integrated. And, and this is how we share, right, as a community. So we all are supporting each other. No one is going to be able to do it all themselves.
Yeah.
But I am grateful for the areas that I was called to early on in my life.
Yes. Thank you. And I did interrupt you. I'm so sorry. So if there's more that you'd like to share, either in terms of looking back or in terms of where you'd like to spark out into in this conversation, please do.
Great. Well, you had come to me with the frame of parenting within this moment in history, and I am a parent. I have a 5.5-year-old son. So I've only been a parent during this time. I have nothing to compare it to. And as I reflected a bit on the immensity of becoming a parent and the immensity of becoming a parent at this time, I thought, what I'd first like to offer is to sort of pan back a bit and to look at a larger frame of where we are energetically. This helps me to, I'm someone who really likes to look at the vast map so that I can have some context of, you know, like a you are here pinpoint.
Yeah.
um, and so I'll bring up an image in a moment, but what I'd like to offer is that pretty much every culture, certainly indigenous cultures, and to a greater or lesser degree, our more modern religious structures, not so much industrial capitalist thought, but other cultures have some way of working with the idea, the experience of a cycle. How we move in cycles, how our consciousness develops in cycles, how we grow in cycles, and a reverence and an ability to participate, engage consciously with where you are in the cycle.
Yeah.
And I like the term the medicine wheel, which is a particularly native framing on this, but you also have in the Eastern traditions, you have the concept of the mandala, which literally means circle.
Sure.
Right? Or you have in Hinduism, you have the yugas, the ages. And right now we're in the Kali Yuga, the dark age. Yuga being age, Kali can mean black or dark. So,
and not to mention the labyrinth, which can be the metaphor for the mystery,
yes,
diving into the mystery and it having cyclical aspects to it, in at least in some form, some of its forms, where
yes,
we can see some sort of pattern but then get lost again and continue on. So thank
exactly.
you. Please continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, beautiful, right? So there's all this awareness throughout our human history, some way to engage with this larger map, that we're a part of these moving energies, right? So when we think about the medicine wheel, again, I'm going to use that term in particular today because as we move through the wheel, as we move through the cycle, there are different medicines for different periods of time, different healings that we're called to. And in fact, the placement that we are within the wheel itself is a healing in and of itself. Simply to be part of that energy is a way to connect, a healing being a way to connect to the whole, to become more whole, conscious of the whole. So we can connect to source, to divinity, to our center, anywhere within that space, but there are distinctions. So I think it's really helpful to have some sense of where you are in your cycle.
Mm.
And we have many layers of our cycles, of course. Everything moves in a cycle. But if you can get sort of fluent with you can choose any of the varieties of medicine wheels out there from different cultures that resonate with you. But if you can get fluid with the system to a greater or lesser degree, then you can really find that you can orient and land yourself and kind of know what to do and how to be within the energy period that you're in. Like you have at the beginning, you were mentioning that you're at this growth point in this new vision that you're in, right? So that's this particular energy of the cycle, and it has its own medicine,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'll just share here. So this is the medicine wheel that I created, that I work with in my own practice. And this is the very base layer of it, just the foundational energies. So what I want to frame is that where we are as a culture, so this is wherever you are personally in your own healing, in your own medicine wheel, we're all resting at this moment of a planetary energy, a planetary space in the cycle. And where we are is this phase right here. We're moving from realization into dissolution. And depending on sort of where you frame it, we could be farther along in dissolution and closer to death. And what we're talking about here is dissolution of civilization as we know it. Civilization which roughly began about 10,000 years ago with the onset of agriculture. We're at the end of industrialized capitalism. We are at the end of patriarchal thought patterns. They're breaking apart all over the place because they're all one and the same. These things have all moved up together, and therefore they're dissolving together. So to recognize that we're in this quadrant here, which it's very appropriate that we're having this conversation right now because we just crossed the autumnal equinox, and so we're in the fall. Mm-hmm. And this is on the medicine wheel, this is the season of fall. So it's a very dynamic energy space. It's a space with a lot of movement. It is the energy of descent, of going down into the unconscious, into the underworld. So if you think, if you can see my little marker here, right across the way, the sisterhood is over here in spring, when everything is having this external burst. So that's sort of where you are perhaps in your new phase of your work. Here you have the ascent energy with spring, but when you are over here in the fall, we're moving into that descent. We're going into a more internal space, a more reflective space. And it can be a very chaotic time because patterns that have been solidified and kind of crystallized for periods of time are breaking apart all over the place. It's also an extraordinarily creative time, but it can be quite disturbing. Mm-hmm. I'll just pause there for a moment in case you want to jump in. I said a lot.
Well, you did say a lot. It is remarkably easy for me to follow you. So in my experience of trying to put together something in a visual and a verbal way that is conveyable to someone who might not have heard this particular layout before, I think you've done a brilliant job just for how I could follow you at literally every step. And there's some things I could ask about or kind of compare notes with you about the various transition points and some of their dynamics and so on. But I don't want to take you off track because it feels like you're painting this picture so vividly. I just wanted to let you know how clearly it is conveying, and I'll just pause on my questions till you're done painting this picture and see if any of them still are valid.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll just say a little bit more about this arena of presence. And again, it is the landscape upon which we're all living right now. So regardless of where we are, what we're focusing on in our individual unique life task and our particular work that we're called to, we are all being affected by living in the fall of civilization, and certainly, right, climate collapse. It's a time of dissolution, of collapse. So some other just ways that you can tune in and resonate. In this area, we're dealing with the element of fire. So the transformative element. We're dealing with the arrival into a state of maturity. This is the beginning of the elderhood stage of the medicine wheel. So as we cross this line from realization, and realization can take many different forms, but it is an initiatory moment where you move from being one type of being to another type of being. So I think a lot of people at the moment are having a realization that we can no longer hold up the status quo, as you were speaking about, the business as usual, that we can't continue to expand infinitely on a finite planet. There are so many layers of realization that are popping around the culture right now. And each time one of those happens for someone personally, let alone a kind of, cultural movement, such as something like Me Too or Extinction Rebellion that's happening right now, right? These sort of massive realizations of, oh my gosh, things have got to change. it takes a profound toll for the individual, because they've moved from one consciousness to another consciousness. They've literally become a different type of being. And that in and of itself takes a huge amount of resources, inner resources, to sort of go through that kind of change. So I think we're at a period where I really encourage everyone that I work with to find multiple layers of support, multiple layers of communal support, so that they feel like they have not that if you just have kind of one friend that you can call, it's a little too brittle. You're not stable enough. And when we're dealing with this particular time of dissolution, we really need to feel like we have a cushy cushy support system around us that we can go to. So that's something that just in terms of, we can get to practices later in a more full way, but I really encourage people at this time to make sure that when they look around, they have close ties with family, with friends, and then with professionals, mentors of some kind, in whatever you're particularly called to, but that you do have at least a healer in your life of some form or another, someone who can support you. That's not just your friend. And you might be called to other, again, like I'm looking for someone to help me learn farming better, right? Like I need layers of support at this time. So a couple of other things about this area. So as we move into elderhood, part of that process is the process of taking full responsibility for our actions, of learning how to ground into our own space, to stay within our own space, to deal with our own emotional and mental patterns. I know that you had earlier wanted to have a discussion about self-regulation, so we can do that maybe a bit later, but this is part of this. When you think about this area, we're talking about stepping into the person's kind of inner sovereignty. So like you step into your own queendom or kingdom, you step into your own sorceress or sorcerer space. This is also the phase of magic. Again, fire transformation magic. So holding space as an elder in that way. I remember a while ago, I was at Findhorn, which is, if you don't know it, is this extraordinary eco community in Scotland. And I was there for a period of time. And they're full on, they have their own currency, and it's just a very magical place. And I remember walking into one of the sacred spaces there, and they had up a call for an elder circle. And they had the most beautiful description of an elder that I'd ever read. They just said, it doesn't matter how old you are, but they said, if you can hold space for another, then you can join the elder circle. And I think that is something, as we are engaging with the breaking apart of all these energies around us, such a chaotic time. Again, if you think about fall, right? Fall is this very unstable time. Sometimes it's really hot, sometimes it's really cold, all of a sudden it might rain. It's very, very dynamic energy period. Lots of movement, again, lots of movement. So what practices can you put into play to be able to hold space for yourself, not get swept away? So when we're looking and talking about how to work with the medicine for different stages of the cycle, what we're looking at is how to become conversant with that energy, how to become responsive, collaborative with that stage of energy, rather than just getting unconsciously swept away into the energy. And to be unconsciously swept into this period of time is to really go into a kind of ungrounded hysteria, a kind of ungrounded space of chaos, despair, as you mentioned earlier, as these stable emotional and mental and physical patterns of ways of being begin to break apart, everything that's been repressed during that time comes up for grabs. So you're dealing with a massive upheaval of unconscious material. And, you know, we're seeing this all over the place, just like, and it's great in some ways because it's this wonderful opportunity for purification and cleansing. But if you get swept away by it, you can get spiraled into great waves of anger, despair, rage, etc. And that's not really useful for anyone. The last thing I'll just mention, or maybe the last two things before we pause again, is that I think I said earlier, this is the period where we begin to turn to go inside and to reflect. So on the early stages of the medicine wheel, we're in the spring and the summer seasons, we're at this outward going, reaching, and that's appropriate, this, you know, massive expansion. And as we can see in our particular culture, which is sort of wanting to freeze in spring. So industrialized capitalism has tried to stop its energetic flow in spring. It's asking for constant, massive growth, constant, massive expansion. And that's obviously not healthy. The medicine wheel has to keep moving. So we're seeing the impossibility of that. But it is appropriate during, if one is appropriately in those stages, that your focus is outwardly turned primarily. But as we make this turning into the fall, we're called to move back and internally explore. So that's an important moment that, right, as all of these things are exploding around us, it's a call, again, not to necessarily, getting active is important, and we can talk about that, you know, how to get active in a way that is authentic for your own calling and for the medicine that you can offer to the world at this time. But to just sort of get swept into action can take you away from the call to really reflect and see these patterns and just sort of do the inner healing that you need to do. And we're vastly out of balance with that in this culture, the ability to turn inside and to reflect inwardly. So there's a big call at this time to slow down, to stop, to pause. Again, if we just tune into the space of autumn, right? The trees, the plants, the earth is drawing its energy back inwards. And it's a time for harvesting, not for growing, but to harvest what you've already done. And so this is the time where we rest in our culture as the culture collapses, the climate collapses around us. And we do our work, our healing work, our harvesting work. But we have to work with that energy moment and know that a lot of that is to simply just stop and to pause and to let the impact and the awareness of what has come before come to us. So there's a lot of work, you know, a lot of inner work that's called for during this time. I'll just pause there if you want to.
I am thrilled by your layout of this sacred cycle, this 9 stages of a sacred cycle that you put together. It absolutely conveys, as I mentioned before, and there's so much that I'm so excited to speak with you about some of the distinctions in between them and the transition points and the dynamics between them and so on. I still don't want to go down those rabbit holes until I know that you've said what you want to say, shared what you wanted to share. But it is so exciting. There's so many overlaps with not only the work that I've been putting together, but the others who are attracted to this conversation at large, including the parenting in these times conversation. It's clearly time for this knowledge to be coming through because there are so many overlaps. So I just wanted to share that. It's so exciting to hear your particular layout. It is so clear and strong. and the synergy is palpable. So that's what all I would say right now, because I don't want to get in the way of your flow. And thank you.
Okay, yay. I'll just offer a few more things. And again, I started saying, I know we're going towards parenting at this moment. And for me as a parent, it's helpful, again, to have some kind of map to understand that this is the moment in history that my child chose to come onto this earth.
Mm.
And to trust that there's a reason for that, that there's so much healing to do at this time on the planet. I think every one of us, every human, non-human, all beings at this time, we are both called to learn about healing and to offer our own healing. So, we all have whatever particular skills that we can serve with, that we can offer, that can be healing balms to others. And then we have the areas that we need to call in the healing and to receive healing. And again, that's appropriate to this period.
Around this disillusion is where I see you circling.
Yes, to this moment of dissolution.
Yeah.
Right, where things are breaking apart. And the beauty of this time is that it's the time when patterns can become clear in a way that they never were before. So when you're earlier in the cycle, in a way you're enmeshed with the patterns, and that's appropriate. You're sort of unconsciously enmeshed. You're kind of doing your life. Once you cross the realization initiation point, then you move into the ability to have distance so that you can really see what you've been doing and choose to take those energies that are breaking apart and to transform them, to transmute them into new patterns. And that takes a great deal of will, of intent, again, and of magic. This is the time of magic, of transformation. So there's, an unbelievable amount of horrific things happening on the planet at this time. And you spoke about sobriety in your opening. And I do think it's important to be as truthful and direct as you can, as much as you can bear to face the amount of uncountable atrocities that we're facing. Because for me, that grounds me in reality. You can't really do much if you're not engaging with reality. And as painful as it may be, when we can face truth and face reality, then we can have our feet on the ground and we can actually move and start to transform things. So the one thing that I did want to add to this, that I've found useful, that goes with this, in Greek mythology, I'm sure many people know of this to a greater or lesser extent. There are rivers that run into the underworlds. So most people know the river Styx, right? That's sort of the one that most people know. So
yep.
In Greek mythology, there are 5 rivers. And in this phase, as we're going into the descent, moving into the underworld as we go across the thresholds past death, we have these 5 rivers that we can run on. And I want to name them because I found them, again, a really useful map to just ground into and go, oh, these are these things. And for the women that are listening, women, I think, have a particular resonance with the cyclic movement because we move through it every month when we're in our active menstruation cycle. And even though that's been particularly flattened in our culture and sort of pushed to the side, again, in this moment of history, there's like a calling for the wisdom of the feminine to come back forth. And one of those reasons is that the woman knows, to a certain degree, depending on how much she's been able or allowed by her culture and her life to engage with her cycle, she every month is cycling through this entire energy process quite directly. Mm-hmm. So for women, this is the phase before menstruation begins. This is the premenstrual phase. And as women know, there's about a week, you know, certainly a few days where you are just in an extremely chaotic energy field, hormonally, emotionally. And so I use these 5 rivers, particularly when I'm teaching women, to help them orient to how to work with those energies. But I think it really works for, again, our larger moment. So the 5, I won't try to say them in Greek because I'm not Greek and I'm sure I would just butcher them.
Okay.
I'll just say that straight up front. So again, these are rivers, energy, right? Emotion, the emotional space, these rivers that we flow on, that are released during these times. The first one is sorrow and pain, the river of sorrow and pain. The second one is hate, the river of hate. The third one is the river of lamentation or wailing, the river of wailing. The fourth one is the river of fire. Again, right, this is the energy quadrant of fire. And the fifth one is the river of oblivion, the river of unmindfulness or forgetfulness. And I'll just say a little bit about each of these because there are positive and negative spaces. So as I go through these, you know, you can just sense for yourself, like, where do you tend to go, right? Like, what river do you go down when you watch the news, when you hear about, you know, another species going extinct, when you hear about the Amazon being cut down? What river moves for you? And again, you know, I think we go down all of them, but we tend to have, each of us individually will have kind of preferences of the rivers that we go down. So if you can know that you have a preference for a particular movement, that your emotion, your energy goes in that motion, then you can tune in and go, okay, how can I center myself in a life-giving relationship to that river rather than a destructive one? So I'll just say a little bit about the kind of positive and negative ways that you can move down these rivers, or what, you know, constructive and destructive sides of them. So the river of sorrow and of pain. So I think one destructive way that we go down this river is to move into a space of depression, of apathy, of pulling away from others. And a constructive way that you can explore if you're someone who tends to go down the river of sorrow is to bring your will, to bring your explorative nature to connecting, to engaging compassion, sharing with others in your sorrow, sharing grief, having conversations. So rather than kind of getting under the covers and pulling the covers over your head, to reach out for the phone and to call someone and say, I'm feeling so sad right now. You know, can you just sit with me and listen to me? Or, you know, can we just sit in silence together? And certainly, again, also a way that's destructive to deal with the energy or the river of pain and sorrow is to pretend that it's not happening, to just, you know, repress it and say, I'm fine, it's cool. The climate is collapsing, 200 species are going extinct every day. That's okay. I'm sure it'll all be fine, right? So we try to find what are the constructive ways that we can create containers to hold these rivers, to hold these emotions that we have that are appropriate, again, that are absolutely appropriate and necessary for the healing of this dissolution phase, of this collapse time. The second one is hate, right? The river of hate. And I find particularly in the kind of spiritual atmosphere that we've come from, that we're climbing out of. Hate is this energy that has just been demonized in this intense way. And from my perspective, when we're on the physical plane, we're dealing with duality. And if you have love, you're going to have hate. They go hand in hand. So if you can't feel hate, you can't really feel love. And there's certainly a higher love that encompasses love and hate that we can move into. And that's beautiful. That would be like for a whole other podcast. But what I'm talking about here is your own personal instinctual wisdom to know what feeds your life force and what does not.
Mhm.
And that I encourage people to give themselves a large allowance to say no to hate what does not feed their life force. And that doesn't necessarily mean to act out violently. I think we often equate the emotion of hate with having to align it with some kind of harm to self and others, but it doesn't have to be like that. It can just be an awareness that this is a no. I have a no for this. Right? Like I have a no for them burning the forests in the Amazon.
Yes.
I hate that. Right? There's all kinds of things I hate about this culture. I
Yeah.
hate that every 18 seconds a woman is beaten. I hate it. And what that allows me to do is to then move in and claim the things that I love. So if you're someone that feels like you're called to flow down the river of hate, then rather than go into the destructive space of just spiraling down into the hate and moving into those feelings of I just want to destroy everyone and this is horrible,
Yes.
then I encourage you to explore, can you launch off of that hate and claim what you love, claim your values, right? I hate that a woman is beaten every 18 seconds. What I love is when women are treated well. How can I help that happen in this culture? Right? How can I move along that river in a way that connects me? Again, in a life-giving way.
Beautiful. You know, you're having me recall a strong experience in a number of different work that reconnects workshops from Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown. And I think that's a particularly strong suit of the work that reconnects is exactly what you're offering right here, is that reframing in our experience as we're in the flow of that river in the way that you're talking about it, to be able to go from the typical default binary, which is to go into action through hate, which means violence and destruction, and instead to be able to take that, if I may just say, the pause that you keep talking about, pause and allowing a whole different framing and a whole different direction for our attention toward what is the life-giving expression that's called for out of that spark, the spark of that experience, the spark of that judgment, the spark of that hatred. So thank you. I was just inspired to recall that from the work that reconnects. It seems like a beautiful fit with what you're laying out. So please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the pause is, are you able to see me, by the way, or are you just looking at the diagram?
I'm able to see you and me in the upper right-hand corner of our screen. I'm not quite sure if we're going to be able to get that, that people will be able to see that as well. I don't know if it's being recorded.
Okay, well, I'll stop the sharing for now just so we can see while I'm talking about this. I can
Okay, good. Yeah, please.
But yeah, I think the pause is a miracle. I mean, the pausing is truly a gift from the divine. It is a space of grace, genuinely, every time. And it's amazing how challenging it can be to recall that we have the ability to choose to pause all the time.
Yeah.
And it's good to, as we talk about it, you know, I'm remembering I can pause more. And it gives us an opportunity to do so much. It's amazing what a single breath and a pause can do to change the whole energy of the situation, give you an opportunity to make a different choice.
Yeah.
And again, when we're talking about that moment of these patterns breaking apart, even though the patterns are breaking apart, we're still, we're enculturated to go in these particular patterns, and it's very hard to break out of them. They're deep, deep grooves. So the pause is just a fantastic tool to say, wait a minute, is that what I want to do? Is that what I want to say? Is that how I want to be? Right? Is that in line with my current time values or not?
Mhm. Yeah.
And it doesn't take a long time to reflect on that. And you can even just, again, use sort of the river of hate, which you could also frame as the river of yes and no, and go, do I have a no for this? Or do I have a yes for this?
Hmm.
Truly. And get that information.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so along our tours of the rivers, there's 3 more. So the river of lamentation and wailing. So this one, the destructive energy of the river of lamentation and wailing, I think in particular is complaining, where we are just sort of called to rant out of the mouth about everything that's bothering us,
Hmm.
without considering whether it can be held by the other person or not, whether considering that if is it appropriate,
Yeah.
right? And I do think it's meaningful to recognize that at this time, there's so much that wants to express. So again, in dissolution, the patterns are breaking apart. All this energy is being released. This tremendous release of energy is coming up, and it wants to express, and it wants to express creatively. This is the, in the medicine wheel, this is the area of the 5th chakra of the throat. So it's the time of this, like, right? So that energy will be there. It
Hmm.
will be there, and we're going to feel it. We're going to feel, we get all choked up, right, in this space. I remember seeing, I often recount this image that I saw a long time ago. It struck me so deeply, again, particularly for women. It was an image of women in a line who were watching their men go on a train off to war. I think it was, I can't remember if it was World War I or World War II. And there were all generations, from little girls to grandmothers, standing in this line, and every one of them was like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that is the state that so many of us rest in. We're arrested in this area. We don't know how to speak. We don't know how to express the depth of what we're feeling. And we feel impotent to do anything, right?
Yeah.
So in this moment, we're called to express, we're called to be active, and that it takes some time to build skill in that area, to not just start ranting. So that's the deconstructive space of the wailing. The constructive space is to create personal and communal rituals of expression. And this can be as simple as getting in a circle and going one by one around the circle, and just agreeing that everyone's going to hold space, and everyone just says whatever they want for 5 minutes. I mean, there's countless ways that we can do this. Singing circles, wailing circles, right? There are traditions all around the world where you'd have these professional mourners, right? These women who are professional wailers, and they would come and they would express for the community through their voice what the community, the ones who are actually grieving, weren't prepared or couldn't hold on their own to express. So again, another, how can we connect, forge relationship during this time? So key, as things are breaking apart, as we feel the kind of movement to get perhaps more isolated through our confusion, through the chaos, through the disorientation of going like, what kind of world is this? That we can bring our energy to really forging connection. I think that's such a key part of the medicine of this time, is forging conscious connections that again align with our current time values. So communal rituals of expression that feel really life-giving to you and that allow you to speak your truth in ways that are held. I had an experience of this just yesterday or 2 days ago. I thought, oh, I've gone down the river of wailing, where I'd been listening for quite some time to a series of anti-pornography activism talks. And I sat down with my husband. I hadn't seen him in a couple days. I had been away, and I, just started to tell him about all this stuff. And I just watched him, like, I didn't talk for that. I talked for maybe 5 minutes, and then I went, "I'm sorry, is this too much?" And he's like, "I was not prepared to hear like what you just said."
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." So it's like we live in this culture of disruption, right? Especially with the internet, where it's almost like we have this picture that we get that, anything should be able to come in at any time, but that's so horribly unhealthy for us. In Buddhism, one of the things that I loved from the years that I studied Buddhism was they had these different levels of nourishment. And, there's like the physical nourishment, food, sleep, etc. There's emotional nourishment, which in particular is hope. But then the mental nourishment is focus. And of course, this is what meditation builds. But I really got that in this deep way, that focus, the ability to stay with something and think through it or attend to something over time, is nourishment for ourselves. And our culture is breaking that constantly. So I encourage myself to remember, and I encourage others again to explore and experiment in ways that feel resonant for them. How do you create these conscious containers where you can say to a friend or a partner, "I have some things that I'd like to talk about. Is now a good time?" Or like, I have a news thing that I read and I feel really upset about it and I'd like to share it, but it might be challenging to hear. Is that okay for you? Or like, how do you create these spaces so that you can say, "Wait, I gotta pause. I'm full."
Yep.
Right? You can get full in about 30 seconds turning on the I'm full.
Yeah.
Like that's going to take me a week to digest and integrate.
Yeah. I'm wary of breaking in, but I do want to mention that my experience actually takes it just one step further, and I'm pretty sure we're on the same page about this. That we've now come to normalize a level of traumatizing ourselves at the cultural level, and that of course diffuses down through all the layers down to the extremely personal and intimate level. But because we've normalized it, we don't know what we don't know about what's going on. We have no idea that we're up to our earlobes in this. And so it's a rare thing, like your comment about how it went between yourself and your spouse, that you even checked in and that he had the ability to articulate, yeah, this is too much for my capacity in this moment, and so on. So I want to just validate everything I'm hearing you say and take it even to the next level, which it scares me that much more, that our shadow, we are so in a shadow driven world, and in the blind spot created by that shadow, we are traumatizing ourselves and each other and the earth at truly a deadly level, and we don't even know that we're doing that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm absolutely right on with what you're saying. It takes a tremendous amount of work and will and support to build these structures into place. We don't have them in place. They
Right.
are not modeled to us in the dominant culture. The majority of us were not modeled in our family. We did not have conscious conversations or boundaries. And so to sort of think that you could like just magically pop in and be able to do those things, I have not had that experience. You know, it takes a tremendous amount of attention. And I think it's, you know, it's a miracle for any person when that consciousness starts to come in where you go, could this be different? Or like, is this really the way it's supposed to be?
Yeah.
You know, like that question, just that little like, really? Or like, why is it like this? You know, I just tell people, I'm like, go with that. Like that is going to start to unravel your own personal sweater of like recognizing where we are. And in terms of parenting, I know I've been talking about all these other things, but again, for me, it's like, you know, sort of the landscape that we rest in as parents.
Yes.
But in terms of parenting, I'll just say more specifically this, that when I became a parent, and I think this is available to probably all parents. I mean, unless you're, you know, really overcome by trauma patterns, which certainly a good number of us are, but it's just so obvious how miraculous life is. And, you know, it's just like this child comes forth. They weren't on the planet. And then they are. It's like, oh my gosh. Like literally that child was not there and now they're here in all their fullness, being completely themselves, having, just as everything else does on this planet, their own self-organizing intelligence, knowing exactly what they want to do, what interests them, what doesn't. It's like, oh, wow, what a miracle. And that miracle keeps going, right? It's like, it doesn't stop when they're 6 months old. It doesn't stop when they're 55 years old. Life is a miracle. And so I think that, you know, for me, you can have that initiation into the miraculousness of life. You don't have to be a parent, right? That's available in any way. If you're open to it, you can be initiated into that all day long, right? Parenting is a particularly forceful one. You know, it really forces the issue, I think. And with that, when I look at my son, I was, you know, somewhat climate conscious beforehand, but nothing compared to once that child came out of my body and I went, life is 100% miraculous and should be 100% supported everywhere. Hands down, I have no question about it anymore. Whether it's a tree person, a squirrel person, a snail person, an ocean person, I don't care. They should be supported. They should have the ability to express themselves, their vitality, you know, live in community and have their life. You know, so in terms of that unraveling, that kind of the way you were talking about us traumatizing ourselves, like how do you tap in to the force of grace that comes with life energy and keep feeding yourself that, keep nourishing yourself that, because everything in our culture, our dominant culture, industrial capitalism, patriarchy, civilization, for the most part, is not nourishing you. It's not feeding you. It's not feeding your life force. It's feeding your death force. And it takes a lot. It's painful to recognize that. It's deeply, deeply painful, right? You go down the river of pain and sorrow to recognize that.
Yeah.
And then again, you need support, you need structures, right? Conversations, spiritual practices, cultural, communal practices. You really do need structures to help you connect with the vitality of life force. The idea that we could just like kind of magically do it on our own while the entirety of culture is banging down on us, trying to destroy our connectivity with the miracle of life. It's like, you know, it again, in Buddhism, they talk about ignorance, and they talk about ignorance. It's not just not knowing something. It's literally a force against wisdom. It's a force that presses against your ability to see things clearly, to see reality as it is. And that is our culture. It's a force against life, a force against connectivity. So just to finish up the rivers quickly. So the next one is fire. And I'll just say quickly, so, you know, the destructive side of the river of fire, which is transformation. The destructive side, I think, is just going unconscious and letting yourself be kind of taken with the flow of whatever is the latest fad, like wherever the energy tends to be going, crowd mentality, right? Which in our culture, if we grow with the crowd mentality, we're just going to keep destroying the earth till we all go extinct. So the positive side of the fire of transformation is to participate in the transformation, again, to consciously bring your will, choose any value you want, right? Doesn't matter, like, I'm sure any one of us, if we asked, what do you value? And you write down the top 3 values, and then just go, okay, how is my life working in accordance to that? Or just the first one, right? Like just choose one value and try to align your actions as much as possible with that value, and you'll transform your life very quickly. I mean, again, I certainly, as a parent, I want this child to be around kindness, you know, to be spoken to be treated kindly and well. And that became like just a focal point for me for cleaning up my own relationship to speech, my own way that I communicated with my spouse, really getting conscious of going, so who are his teachers, right? This idea that we like just send our child off to school. We have no idea who their teachers are, what their values are. Do they align with us? What are their personal traumas? Where are they coming from, right? So really like taking, without being hopefully too overbearing, but like saying, you know, I have a responsibility to make sure this child is surrounded by people who are going to at least add to the kind of environment, the kind of atmosphere that I'm wanting him to live in. So participating in that river of fire, that river of transformation, can be a very powerful one, right? That's like the sorcerer space where you get into the magic. And then lastly, the river of oblivion and forgetfulness. And what's really interesting in Greek mythology, this river runs through the cave of Hypnos. So the cave of sleep, the god of sleep. And in the destructive way in our culture that we run this river is the way that we degrade our life force through different forms of intoxicants, through drugs, through, as you were talking about earlier, overwhelming our nervous system with information so that we become numb, we shut down. Too much stimulation. And that, you know, again, that's a big one. We can just keep going back to the pause, right? Pausing to stopping. Turn off the computer, turn off the music, just turn things off. It's really easy. Just stop. Just stop. I mean, some things aren't so easy to stop, but the ones that you can, stop as much as you can. And you'll immediately feel saner.
Yes.
Well, I say that, and actually I should say this, because what I found with myself and with others is that when we stop, there's often a buffer space that you have to go through that can be quite uncomfortable, where the stuff that was in place that you had kind of quieted or numbed out to becomes louder. Just like when people are overworking and they stop and then they go, well, now I got a cold, right? It's like, well, that's been just waiting to express itself.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
So I think that's important to note for people to just know that if you're overstimulated, exhausted, depleted, which almost all of us are, way more than we can imagine. I resigned from my professorship now almost 4 or 5 years ago. And it took me 3 years, I'd say, just to kind of clear out the vibrational energy from the noise that was going on from my work environment.
Yes.
And it still pours out in my dream state, in my, there's so much that we have to process. We're like way backed up. The processor's backed up.
Yes. And again, we don't know that we don't know how
Right.
saturated we are with
Right.
that energy of the business as usual human operating system on the planet. I love that you keep returning us to that level of self-awareness. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be painful, but I'll just say that I have found with the people that I work with, the groups that I work with, and with myself, again, and this is appropriate to the phase, to the dissolution phase, it's the stuff that's been pressed down is meant to come up for a healing.
Yeah.
So just know the stuff will come up, but that doesn't mean that something's wrong or that you should turn back on the computer or like, suddenly rush out and or start texting on your phone just because you're having an uncomfortable feeling. It means that you've actually done something quite healing. You've created a pause, a space where something that's been waiting to express finally feels safe enough to come out and say, hey, I've been waiting to talk to you. I've been waiting to say whatever your body's saying, your emotions are saying, or your mind is saying. And that's a gift. You get to know yourself better in that moment. So, again, I keep saying to bring your will, because I find this is a time of focusing the will to, in those moments, say, okay, it's all right. I'm not going to reach for the phone. And noticing how we tend to reach out for whatever it is we reach out for. And that's part of this river of oblivion, is that we think we'll feel better in the destructive way. We think we will feel better if we can just cover it up with food, with noise, with conversation, whatever it is, right? So the positive form of that, the constructive form of the river of oblivion, is the pause that we've been talking about, is genuine rest, true rest, taking life-giving breaks, taking space, allowing yourself that. And, that seems like in our conversation, mostly me talking today, that's the one that keeps coming up, so maybe that's really the one to highlight for people, to invite them, again, in their own way. I really invite people to move into an experimental space. It's like, really see what works for you, get curious. It has to be yours, otherwise what's the point, right? Then you're just doing somebody else's practice. But to figure out how you can rest more. And I say this to clients all the time. I go, how can you do less? How little can you do? And I need to say that to myself all the time too.
Absolutely.
How little can I do in this conversation, in this moment? Can I rest?
Mm. I'm really struck by, I just feel like I've stumbled upon a tree so full of fruit that it's staggering to really touch into clearly a body of work that you've been putting together for quite some time. And again, just your gift at being able to convey each piece of it so clearly at such an assimilable level, and in such an assimilable tone and way. Really feels like a blessing. And here we are, but really the envelope of our time together is rapidly closing. And if I may be so bold, I suggest this is the first of hopefully many conversations. And I'd be happy to post this as sort of a primer, an introduction to your wide and deep body of work. And what I appreciate especially is, Mirah, that you've with each segment, you've so brought these little moments from your own experience, and you've laid it straight across what you're describing to us from the body of work. And so I just feel like it's been this generous sharing on your part from your own life and your own experience, in addition to the knowledge and wisdom that you've got going on. I'm particularly struck by, I don't know what else to call it right now, but the mythic level that you've brought in your layout, be it in the medicine wheel orientation or in the rivers orientation. Both really took me to a space in which there was room for me to take this information and this sharing in as personally as I wished, but I could, at any moment, I could expand out with you to a far larger frame to include humanity. And I could really expand at as large a scale as I wished, given how open the field was that you were describing for us. So just really want to thank you for that. And I'm struck again by the synergy that keeps showing up that I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this episode. I once again feel like I could not have possibly scripted a more articulate and gorgeous sharing on your part to be a part of this next chapter of this body of work expanding, and to include other rich rivers of wisdom and of sharing. So I guess in this long-winded way, I'm thanking you for this level of introduction and sharing that you've been doing, and acknowledging just what a gorgeous fit it seems to be. And it feels like a real blessing.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to get clearer with myself about what's important to me and what I'm exploring. And I would just say that, you know, my work in this particular life is around the spirit, and I think, you know, that we can often feel pinned in to a very small life, and whatever practice people feel called to, there's multiple traditions that are authentic and fantastic, and I celebrate and validate all of them. You know, an authentic spiritual practice, what it will do is it will connect you to your multidimensionality, to your vastness, and to your life force, to your vitality. And should, again, if it's working, if it's right for you, it will connect you to a direct experience of your connectivity with divinity, and the recognition that we're all connected in that space. So I'll just say one more time that it's so helpful for me to have some kind of map. And I find, you know, I'm always looking for maps, and I'm crafting maps that feel accurate to me, to kind of, how can I land to some orientation point? Otherwise, I'm just overwhelmed by the scathingness of the physical plane. I mean, it's an overwhelming place to be. And I find, you know, in the 20 some years that I've worked as a counselor, in a variety of ways, it's like the single most thing I hear people ask is, what am I supposed to be doing? Or am I doing the right thing? Yeah. You know, it's sort of like, and of course I can't answer that question for them. Only you can answer that question for yourself. But I feel like, and most spiritual texts, if you read them, sort of in the beginning, the querent is going, what should I do? Like, how do I figure out living here, right? Yeah. So So I'm saying this to say, I think, again, during this time, this moment of collapse, climate collapse, cultural collapse, collapse of civilization, collapse of patriarchy, perhaps the collapse of your marriage, perhaps the collapse of your job, perhaps the collapse of your personal communal ecosystem, collapse, right?
Yes.
During that time, what practices do you have? Right? If you don't have them, I encourage you to look for them, ask for them to come to you, right? What practices do you have that can connect you to your own life force, to your own vitality, to your own sense of being able to ground and to connect in a vital way with yourself and others in a loving way? That's, get a connection to that spirit. And that can be one way that you can be guided. So
That
one
might
map
be
a day, or two maps, maybe the rivers and the medicine wheel, but we can do some other talks. I'd love that, and talk about other maps or go deeper into these.
right. And we haven't even touched really on the whole topic of practices that you're bringing up now. And I have a feeling that could be multiple sessions. And what I'd like to do is wrap us up for this particular episode of this podcast. And if I could ask you to stick around after I turn off the record button, and so we could connect a little bit about possible future episodes. And I just want you to know how rich I experience this conversation to be, and to be able to meet you and to get a brief immersion in your body of work and in your way of doing your work is it's extraordinarily inspiring. I really thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Mirah, I'm wondering if people wanted to find out more about you, is there a way that we could finish up this particular podcast with giving them access? Do you have a website or other ways that people might be able to contact you or read books or whatever else you might have?
The easiest thing, I used to have a website and actually a whole sort of the schmear of podcasts and all of that. And in my own practice of stopping, of pausing, I took it all down. And that was a great healing for me in my life, to make space to go deeper in my own work. So I keep things very low key these days. And so if people want to communicate with me, they can just email me. My email is my name, Mirah, M-I-R-A-H, Love Wisdom, MirahLoveWisdom @gmail.com. And you can just reach out and say anything you want to say, and we can be in contact. I also have coming up a 3-day retreat for women. It's a women's circle retreat, the first weekend in December. And if people are interested in that, it's here in Ojai. I often do online classes, but that's an in-person only. But it's a phenomenal time to come together. And in particular, this year, we're talking about boundaries, how to create and sustain healthy, energetic boundaries in your life and in your family and work. So people can, if there are women listening and you're interested in getting together and exploring that, you're welcome to contact me.
So that's the first week in December 2019 in Ojai, California.
In Ojai, California, yes. The 6th and the 8th, I think, Friday through Sunday.
All right.
Yeah, feel free to email me, MirahLoveWisdom @gmail.com.
Very good. And I'll put all that information in the show notes of this particular episode as well. So without further ado, Mirah, thank you so much. And I look forward to hopefully many more opportunities to have you on the Poetry of Predicament. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website,
www.livingresilience.net is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.